My name is Elizabeth Cannon. I'm at the grave of my husband, James Cannon. He was the first man to enlist in the Civil War from Mankato, Minnesota. I'd like to tell you a little bit about him and his life. He was born in New York City to Scottish immigrants. When he was 10 years old, his father died, so he went to work. He became an apprentice for a carriage maker. Later, he had his own business, and he moved west to Rochester, Minnesota, and later to Mankato. In 1861, when the Civil War broke out, he was 40 years old. He sold that paint store at no profit and enlisted in Company I of the 1st Minnesota. Now, the 1st Minnesota didn't have regular uniforms. They had red shirts at their first battle, at First Bull Run, and James was injured in the right leg. He lay on the ground a total of 5 days before he was transported to Libby Prison, where he was held prisoner for 6 months. Over the next year, pieces of bone worked their way out of his leg. After he was released from prison, he was sent to Philadelphia to recover. And about 1 year later, June 2nd, he rejoined his company at Fair Oaks. He wasn't in camp but less than a half hour that he got hit again by a shell. At first, the injury seemed not to be too bad, so he stayed with his regiment and with his company through 7 days' battle, but his condition became worse and he was sent to Annapolis to recover. He was discharged later that year, November of 1862, and sent back to Mankato to fully recover. During that time, he did not lay idle. He worked to recruit other men for the Union Army, and he re-enlisted in 1864 with the 11th Regiment, where he served the rest of the war in Tennessee, guarding railroads. Here's a picture of him later in life. He was so well thought of by his comrades in the Grand Army of the Republic, the Alexander Wilkins Post here in Mankato, Post 19, that twice he was elected president of that veterans organization. He was a stalwart and courageous man. Thank you.
Good morning. I am General James Baker, and I'm originally from Ohio. That's where I was born. But I came to Minnesota in 1857, actually, and I settled in Garden City. And I had a farm there, and I was very happy. But, wouldn't you know it, politics caught up with me. I had actually been the Secretary of State in Ohio, and so when the new state of Minnesota, which was created in 1858, when they needed a Secretary of State, I was called upon. And like George Washington, I left my home behind, left my family, and went to serve my state. In 1861, the Civil War began, and I resigned the position of Secretary of State and was appointed Colonel, actually, of the 10th Minnesota. Now, the 10th Minnesota has the distinction, I guess you could say, of being one of the 4 regiments that was present when the 38th Dakota were hanged in Mankato. And of course, Mankato not being far from Garden City, it was next to being my hometown, and eventually it would become my hometown. But because I was familiar with Mankato, and I was Colonel of the 10th Minnesota, I was actually on guard, on duty, when this execution took place on December 26, 1862. Now, shortly thereafter, I was appointed by General Sibley. General Grant comes later. But I was appointed by General Sibley to help with the mop-up expedition in the West. In October of 1871, this is following the war, I went on to become Surveyor General of Minnesota. Grant had made me Provost Marshal of the Department of Missouri. I served a number of unique and important positions, but one of the things that I'm the most proud of is the fact that in 1879 I actually took 2 foundling newspapers that were doing okay, but they weren't certainly weren't your New York Times. But I took the Mankato Daily Review and the Mankato Record, and I merged them into something that I thought we could be proud of, and you know it today as the Mankato Free Press. So I'm actually the founder of the Free Press. Now in 1880, I built a beautiful home in Lincoln Park, just a few blocks from the site, or what would become the site, of the Boy in Blue Memorial. That was built in 1893 with the help of the Grand Army of the Republic, Alexander Wilkin Post, which I'm proud to be a member of, along with a number of my other comrades who served for Minnesota, and the Women's Relief Corps. Together we built this wonderful monument. But I also had a house in that neighborhood. I moved from Garden City in 1880 to Mankato and made that my permanent home, and I would live there until my death in 1913. Now, as far as family, I actually had two wives, but let me explain that carefully. In 1871, I married my first wife, and she bore me two sons, Arthur and Harry. That was Rose Thurston, and I lived with her in Garden City, and then we moved ultimately. Well, I went to war. She didn't move, but I went to war. But she died in 1873, and then in 1879, the same year that I founded the Free Press, I actually married Zula Bartlett, who, by the way, one of her ancestors was actually a signer of the Declaration of Independence. So it has a real, you could say freedom has a nice ring to it, as they would say. Now I have a friend, Captain Clark Keyser, who we like to exchange pleasantries, I suppose you could say, or good-natured insults. He's a captain, I'm a general, so I get to talk down to him a little. But at any rate, we would go around to different schools in the community and actually present information about our experiences during the Civil War. And of course, being the politician, statesman, orator that I was, all of my various experiences came in handy telling these young people what life was like and how they should aspire to do as well in school as they can. Well, one of these young ladies at the Pleasant Grove School, which is very near my home in Lincoln Park, was a young woman by the name of Maud Hart. Perhaps some of you have heard of her. I have great faith that someday this young woman will actually become a writer, because she's always writing, she's always taking notes, she's doing all sorts of things. But that in a nutshell is my career, and I hope you enjoy your stay and your visit to Mankato. Good day. Good morning. I am Captain John Reed Beatty. I was from Ohio. Actually, that's where I was born, back in 1831. And I moved to Minnesota early on. Actually, I married Laura Maxfield, and we had 6 children. And they're gathered with me here today. And I'll come back and talk about my family a little later, because actually something you folks know as the Civil War came up in the middle of all this when I was trying to start a family, settle down, and do what people did. But actually I joined as a private. I joined Company H of the 2nd Minnesota, and I rose to the position of captain, actually, through my military career. But there's one incident that I really want to talk about because it needs some clarification. We were actually at Chickamauga, which is here in Georgia. It's a horrible place. Chickamauga is where many brave men were killed. Unfortunately, I came out of the battle unscathed, but it was a decisive Union loss. As you can see, Chickamauga is the gateway to Georgia, it's the gateway to Atlanta, and ultimately it would be the gateway to Sherman's March to the Sea. But we did not do well in September of 1863. In fact, it was a bloodbath. I had 2 horses shot out from under me in this battle, but fortunately I survived. A few months later, in November of 1863, another battle was fought nearby known as Missionary Ridge. And Missionary Ridge was a high escarpment, and there were Confederate positions on top of this. And our job was to charge that position, which is suicidal. I mean, cannon are aimed down at you. It's a horrible type situation. We actually pushed our way up the hill and overwhelmed the first line of Confederate defenses. There were about 3 or 4 lines of Confederates up on this ridge. And we overwhelmed the first and second lines, but then we were trapped. The Confederates were shooting down on us. Grant was, farther away from his headquarters. He couldn't see what was going on in the battle, except with binoculars, which is like not seeing at all. But I was on the ground. I could see what was happening. And our troops were going to be massacred. So I ordered my bugler, Billings Sibley, who actually accompanied me all the way from Mankato. He was actually one of my students. There were a number of my students in the regiment with me. But Billings Sibley sounded the charge, and we drove straight up that hill, and we were able to push those Confederates off. Grant, watching all this, said, "Who ordered that charge?" "I never ordered that charge." No one would tell. It was top secret, because if the charge had failed, I would have been slated for court-martial. In fact, it wasn't until many years later, after my death, that it was finally revealed that I, John Beatty, was the man who ordered the charge at Missionary Ridge. Now, I came home on leave in 1864, and that's when I married my wonderful wife, Laura Maxfield. Of course, we had to wait until after the war before I could have my 6 children, but nonetheless, times were good after the war. But I also participated in Sherman's March to the Sea in 1864. So the March to the Sea, that's the completion of Sherman's goal here, was to get to the sea and then push north through the Carolinas. I also took part in the Grand March, or the Grand Review, at the end of the war, where I marched with General Sherman's army on the Grand Review's second day. We were all very elated that the war was over, but of course we were also very sad because we had lost our dear President, Abraham Lincoln, just a few weeks before, on April 14th, 1865. I returned to Mankato and actually took up, I actually built the first lime kiln in this area. Got into the stone quarry business with the Maxfields, my in-laws, and I was also the first superintendent of schools in Mankato.
Lucky if this thing still fits after all those years. It's been up in the attic. I didn't think I'd find it. Let's see. Looky there. I thought I gained me some weight, but I'm thinking I'm feeling pretty fit yet. You might be wondering why I got this out of the attic and tried it on again. Sergeant stripes, look at that. But it happened when I got a couple weeks ago. I got a letter in the mail made out to Mr. Milton Hanna. You see that right there? Okay. At any rate, I got to just read this letter to you real quick because it sure did get me all excited. It's postmarked Washington, D.C., July 30th, 1898. Milton Hanna, Esquire, Mankato, Blue Earth County, Minnesota. It says, "Dear Sir, you are hereby notified that by direction of the President and under the provisions of the Act of Congress approved March 3rd, 1863, providing for the presentation of medals of honor to such officers, non-commissioned officers, and privates as have most distinguished themselves in action, a Congressional Medal of Honor has this day been presented to you for most distinguished gallantry in action, the following being a statement of the particular service." And I read, "At Nolensville, Tennessee, February 15th, 1863, this soldier, then a corporal, Company H, 2nd Minnesota, was one of a detachment of 16 men escorting a wagon train that was attacked by 125 cavalry. After a most heroic defense, the attack was repulsed and the train saved. The medal will be forwarded to you by registered mail as soon as it shall be engraved by Tiffany & Sons. Respectfully, P.A. Alger, Secretary of War." Well, when I got this letter a couple weeks ago, I decided to go up and try see if this old uniform would fit again, and you'll never guess what arrived in the mail today. Well, I'll show it to you later. You might be wondering, how did I, a humble person from Mankato, win the Medal of Honor? Well, I'm one of 2 individuals from Blue Earth County that actually won the Medal of Honor, and the other man was my sergeant in Company H of the 2nd Minnesota Volunteer Infantry Regiment. His name was Sergeant LaVille Holmes, and he would eventually end up leading our company. Even though he was a first lieutenant, our captain was pretty busy doing other things, and so he basically took over command of the 2nd Company, of Company H of the 2nd Minnesota. So, let me give you a little background about myself first of all. I was born in 1842 in Ohio to James and Nancy Hanna, and we lived in Ohio. We were a farming family. When I was 11 years old in 1853, we got the itch to go further west, and so we moved out west, and we came to what was then Minnesota territory. And we started farming here, and we liked it in Minnesota, but almost immediately our family was marked with the tragedy. My father, James, died 3 years after we arrived in Minnesota territory. And for a while, Ma and I kept up with the farm, but eventually we opened up a dry goods store and a grocery store, and then something happened. In April of 1861, the dastardly rebels opened up on Fort Sumter, and all young men were called to duty, and I had to answer the call. And it was very hard on my mother, but at 19 years old, I went off to fight in the war between the states. And I joined the 2nd Minnesota. The first, I'd already tried to get into the 1st. The 2nd Minnesota was being raised. I got into Company H, and this is one of the few companies that was actually raised right here in Blue Earth County. And on June 22nd, 1861, I was mustered into the service of the Union Army. The 2nd Minnesota was pretty active. We were fighting in the West, and we actually won the first big battle in the West, won by the Union Army, which was the Battle of Mill Springs, Kentucky. And I was involved in the Siege of Corinth, Mississippi, and also the Battle of Murfreesboro, which was pretty much a stalemate, but it was a bloody affair. But the highlight, I would say, I didn't think it was a highlight at the time, but I certainly look back on it as being one of the more interesting parts of my time in the Army, happened on February 15th, 1863. And we were camped near Nolensville, Tennessee, and it was a cold, frosty morning. We had snow and frost the day before, and a little bit of sleet mixed in with it, so we were pretty much miserable and wet, and a bunch of us smelled like wet dogs. And we were all gathered around the campfire to warm up, and all of a sudden we got placed on a detail. 16 of us were told to guard 10 wagons that would be going out to forage for fodder for our mules. We were getting really low on stuff to feed our mules, and so we were supposed to guard the wagons that went out to forage for the fodder. And so we accompanied them, and we were heading south from camp. We went about 3 miles south on the Nolensville Turnpike, and we came to a crossroads, and our officer, and I forget his name offhand right now, but he ordered 4 of us wagons to turn off to the southeast. But as we were about to turn off, all of a sudden a contraband, a black man come running up to us and warned us, the Yankee soldiers, that there was a whole regiment of Confederate cavalry. He said it was the 6th Alabama Cavalry, and they were 500 strong. Well, we, discretion is the better part of valor. We decided to try and steal clear of that since there was only 16 of us. So we turned off on the turnpike, and we started going down. Next thing you know, about a mile down the turnpike, we saw this farm. And sure enough, there was a corn crib there, and it was filled with corn. We said, that's what we need right there. So the 4 wagons that we were guarding with 16 of us went down, and we started loading up that corn crib. But not before my sergeant, Sergeant Holmes, deployed some of us out as a picket to make sure that this cavalry didn't approach us. We wanted to be ready just in case. So I was deployed down toward a thicket of cedar trees down there, and I just happened to get there right when I heard noise on the other side, and here was a detachment of about 100, at least a company of this regiment of cavalry, Rev Cavalry, the 6th Alabama, and I overheard them speaking, and they went to bragging with one another. And they said, them Yankee soldiers over there, we should go over there and we're going to capture them Yankee soldiers. They won't put up no fight because there's so many of us and so little of them. And so we're going to come and capture those boys and bring them back to our camp. Well, as soon as I heard that, I run as fast as I come back to the sergeant. I said, Sergeant, there's a whole bunch of Rev... I was going to say that, but guess what? I didn't have time to say it. Because as soon as I got back, that Rev Cavalry was starting to come through the gates and coming into the farmstead that we were loading up the corn on. And as soon as that happened, Sergeant LaVille Holmes told everybody to take cover, take cover. Well, I took cover in the barn, in the bottom of the barn, and Sergeant Holmes and a couple other went up in the haylofts above me, and some dang fools, about 3 of us, went into the corn crib. Now, have you ever seen a corn crib with all those slats in the middle of it? You may feel like you're undercover, but there's a lot of holes between them slats, and some of our men got in there. Well, as soon as we got there, Sergeant Holmes says, "Now don't fire until you hear the signal shot. I'll take the first shot. Don't fire until I fire the first shot." So we all agreed to that. We're all taking cover, and here come that Reb cavalry, 125 of them against 16 of us. And as they came through that gate, they spread out by the right and left flank, making a perfect line, and they started coming down at us, and then you heard the charge. "Charge!" they started yelling, these 6 Alabama cavalry boys. They come charging down on us, and they said, "Surrender, you damn Yankees, surrender!" And of course, we waited and waited and waited, and they was getting closer and getting closer and getting closer to us, and we thought, when is Sergeant Holmes going to fire? Because we were ordered not to fire until he fired. Finally, when they were about 3 or 4 rods away from us, Sergeant Holmes opened up with the other 2 men that were up in the hayloft, and that was the signal for all of us to open up. And we fired a withering volley into the oncoming cavalry. Right away, we hit the first horseman or 2, and the guy that was the leader, he had to be probably the leader of that particular group, his horse got shot out from underneath him and fell on top of him. He was pinned down for the whole rest of the fight. We shot about 8 horses right off the bat. The riders dismounted. That was enough to stop the whole charge. Those cavalrymen that survived it and that were not wounded, they rushed back to the fence and they started firing, dismounted, taking cover behind the fence. And we opened up on them, exchanging. I should have said it wasn't just bullets that were firing back and forth. There was a lot of expletives that were going back and forth, if you know what I mean. We were bad-mouthing them, and they were bad-mouthing us, and we were shooting back and forth, and we were getting the best of them. And they kept yelling for us to surrender, and we made so much noise that the 2nd Minnesota heard it, and they come over the hill. They knew we was in trouble, so they come over the hill, and as soon as the Alabama cavalry troopers, they saw this whole regiment coming over the hill, they skedaddled as fast as they could. So we ended up defending those wagons, and we also ended up, well, what happened? Our casualties, we took 3 casualties, and they were just wounds, flesh wounds. Sergeant Lavillo was shot in the hand. He was shot in the hip, excuse me. And the other 2 men were in the corn crib and got splinters in their hands. We also had a wagon tongue broken, and we had one of our mules shot dead. But you know what? We came out on top because they had 3 dead. We left behind 3 dead rebels there. We captured about 8, and we also got 10 horses. 10 of the horses were run off, and they come back to us again. And so we traded 10 horses for our 1 mule, which is a pretty good deal. At any rate, after that, I stayed in the Army, of course. My term of enlistment was for 3 years, and I fought after that at the Battle of Chickamauga and also Shelbyville. But it was Chickamauga that was very memorable too, because I received a pretty severe wound, and I had to drop out of the Army for a short time. I was anxious to get back to my comrades, and I was out until December. And in December, I rejoined the 2nd Minnesota, took part in the long campaign to capture Atlanta, and from there I participated in Sherman's March to the Sea. I was mustered out in June of 1865, and by that time I'd earned the rank of sergeant, which you see this old uniform me wearing right now. What happened after the war? I come back to Mankato, and we ran the store, and we basically turned the store into a restaurant. 4 years after the war, I met this pretty little thing by the name of Louise Purrier, and fell head over heels in love with her, and we were married 4 years after the war. We had 2 children. Some of the things I'll be remembered in Mankato for was, well, I was the quartermaster for many years of the Alexander Wilkin Post of the GAR, the Grand Army of the Republic. And also I was instrumental in building up the Mankato Fire Department to be a very professional organization. And I worked for them on a volunteer basis for 27 years. And so I'm very proud of that record as well. At any rate, that's my story. I guess I should share with you why I put this on. The medal did arrive. And of course, you need to understand, I wasn't the only one who won this one. 16 of us were awarded this Medal of Honor, but they could only find 8 of us. The rest of them either died or they could not be located. And so, I will just show you this magnificent medal. I'm very proud of that. But thank you all for listening.
Hello, my name is Edith Emily Higby Grannis, and I come to you from Glenwood Cemetery in Mankato, Minnesota. I am at the grave of my father, Samuel Higby Grannis, And I want to tell you about him and about his brother. They were in the American Civil War. My father lived to be 93. He had a very long and prosperous life. He fared much better than many other soldiers from that war. When he was 80 years old, I gave him a notebook, and he proceeded to write in that notebook every single day. A few years later, I published that notebook. It is titled, From New Hampshire to Minnesota, The Memoirs of Samuel Higbee Grannis. And I in particular want to tell you about his time in the Civil War and about his brother. They came to Minnesota in 1860, and they settled in the Vernon Center area in Vernon Township. They lived in a 2-room log cabin at first. In 1865, when the dangers of the Indian Wars seemed to have passed, Samuel, my father, and his brother Henry enlisted in Company F of the 1st Minnesota Heavy Artillery. They enlisted in Mankato, and then they were mustered in at Fort Snelling. They traveled south. It was February, so the ice on the river allowed them to travel south as far as La Crosse on the frozen Mississippi River. From there, they took trains through Chicago and on down to Tennessee. Now, this winter travel was very hard on them, and my father spoke jokingly about learning for the first time how to sleep on the soft side of a board, meaning sleeping on the ground. Henry in particular did not fare well, and he caught pneumonia, but he recovered from that, and as hard as the cold weather was on them, the infection and disease that came about in the warmer months was even worse. Henry became very, very ill, and at that time they did not believe that the soldiers were ill. Oftentimes they thought they might be malingering, and so they were still forced to do guard duty. My father still remembers very fondly a man named John Fassett. He was a scrappy Irishman, but he befriended them, and when Henry Grannis's name was called to do guard duty one night when he was very, very ill, John Fassett stepped forward and said, "I'm Henry Grannis," and did the guard duty for him that night. But Henry became even more sick. He was admitted to hospital, and even in hospital, those that were not terribly, terribly sick, that could still get up and walk a little bit, were expected to get up 3 times a night to care for the other men that were even more ill. And in these circumstances, Henry became even more sick. My father went to visit him, and the doctor took him aside and said, "Are you his brother?" He said, "Yes, I am." He said, "He's not going to make it through the night." He sat with Henry, and Henry died in his arms. My father, who was sick himself with the mumps, was so worn down and weary. He lay down beside his brother, and slept there for the rest of the night. In the morning, they took Henry to the morgue. Father came back with a pair of shears and cut a lock of hair off of Henry's head and sent it home to his mother and father, and there it remained a beloved keepsake. My father survived the war, came back, and lived in Mankato. He was quite prosperous. He was a business partner with George Palmer. They owned grain elevators in Minnesota, Iowa, and South Dakota. He sold out his interest to R.D. Hubbard. You may have heard of him from Hubbard Mills. Mother and father built a home at 326 Warren Street in 1915. It still stands. Mother died in 1922. When father was 83 years old, he and I traveled down to Tennessee. Our goal was to go to Henry's grave. We retraced the steps or the path that they had taken in 1865. And we reached Henry's grave, which is marked with a simple stone that says Henry Grannis, Minnesota. At the entrance to the National Military Cemetery at Chattanooga is a tablet that was inscribed in 1863. It reads, No vision of morning strife, the warrior's dream alarm. No braying horns, no screaming fife, at dawn shall call to arms.